Welcome everyone to this Earth Day opportunity for each of us to grow as becoming more ethical consumers. I'm Maurice Lang, Director of Justice and Peace for the Presentation Sisters Union USA unit, and I'm joined by Emily Lucas, our Head of Communications. So welcome to all Presentation Sisters and the larger community of presentation people in the United States, and also to our dear presentation friends from other countries, possibly in the world. I know it's a late time of night for them to join us. So this year, the US unit of Sisters is focused on the goal of ecological economics for their Laudato Si action plan. And we thought that tonight's topic of ethical consuming was especially fitting. So we are glad to gather with you all.
We work for the transformation of unjust systems, the integrity of creation, and the flourishing of humanity and earth. From our way of life, C9.
Thank you, Rosalima. And Karen's going to read to us why we're also gathering in response to Pope Francis's words in Laudato Si about ecological economics.
I would point to the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. The conviction that everything in the world is connected. The call to see other ways of understanding the economy and progress. The value proper to each creature. The throwaway culture and the proposal of a new lifestyle. Laudato Si, paragraph 16.
Thank you. So on this Earth Day evening, let us pause for a short prayer. And this is from the book by Philip Newell called Praying with the Earth. On this day, the blessings of heaven. On this day, the blessings of earth. On this day, the blessings of sea and sky. To open us up to life. To ground us in life. To fill us up with life and with wonder. On those we love this day, and on every human family, the blessings of heaven, the blessings of earth, the blessings of sea and sky. And we are so blessed to have our presenter this evening. Dr. Ellis Jones has been wonderful with me on email and over the phone. It's a pleasure to finally get to meet him this evening. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Is that near Ipswich?
It's about an hour and a half away.
Okay, we're glad to have Massachusetts folks. Ellis has focused his energies on bridging the gap between academics, activists, and the average citizen. A scholar of ethical consumerism, which will all be a little bit more after this evening, good global citizenship, and everyday activism, Dr. Ellis Jones gives presentations across the country on how to turn our highest ideals into practical actions. He has written the best-selling work, The Better World Shopping Guide. It's now in its 7th edition. It's the only comprehensive guide to socially and environmentally responsible shopping that rates companies on a scale of A to F. We're very blessed to be with you, Professor Jones, on this Earth Day evening. Thank you for making time in your schedule for us, presentation people and others. Please, the floor is yours for the next hour.
Well, thanks so much, Maurice, and thanks to everybody for giving up a little bit of your time. I'll try my best to make it worthwhile. Thanks to all of you out there that have shown up for this. I'm going to try to keep my presentation to about 25 minutes or so, and then the rest will be for questions. I'm actually, as you can imagine, I give this kind of presentation a lot, and so I've heard myself speak a million times. I'm kind of bored hearing myself talk, but I love answering questions. And so I love any question that you have, and please, the best questions are the hardest ones. So please don't be afraid to throw some hard balls my way. I love hearing new questions. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Now, can everybody see that? Will you give me a thumbs up or a wave if that is looking like it is coming through?
Yep.
All right. Well, so as a part of Earth Day today, happy Earth Day, everyone. I'm going to be talking about what it means to be an ethical consumer, sometimes referred to as a sustainable citizen consumer. I like that a little bit better sometimes because it gives you more of a sense of what we're talking about, a sort of new hybrid way of thinking about our lives and our roles in the world. I'm particularly interested in effective ways that people can engage all of the issues that challenge us in our present time period. So I'll talk a little bit about my research up front, and then talk about ethical consumerism writ large, and then wrap up with maybe just a little peek at some of the newest stuff that I'm working on that has stemmed from this work. So let me start with my research. It's been about, gosh, almost 25 years now since I was a graduate student, and I co-wrote a book with a few other graduate students. Instead of doing my dissertation, I felt like dissertations were just really academic items that are good at collecting dust for the most part. And I really wanted to do something. I felt that the world needed something much more useful. And so the three of us wrote something called the Better World Handbook. It was an attempt to, in sort of 300 to 400 pages, come up with a guide for individuals who wanted to make a difference in the world around a whole range of questions, social, environmental, justice-related questions, equality, and all of the issues that were confronting us, and boil it down into lifestyle areas, into individual actions that people could take, in particular, everyday people. My guiding principle when I wrote that book with my colleagues was, would my mother be willing to take this action? My mother is not particularly political, but she does care very much about the world. And so that was always sort of my guide going through that work. In any case, that came out in 2001 originally, and then the second edition published in 2007. And out of the 400 or so pages, almost all of the feedback I got was from really 3 pages. And it was fascinating to me. We talked about everything. We talked about, what you could do with your family and travel, and what you could do with your money and with politics and the media, just everything you can imagine. We talked about how you can make a difference in the world. And the 3 pages that really captured people were all about shopping. At first, I thought this a little bit odd, but then I took it seriously. And then in 2006, I published the first shopping guide. It became my publisher's best-selling book at the time, and now in its 7th edition has sold
Take the
around
next right onto Wurzbach Road.
200,000 copies. So
Take
this
the next
guide,
right onto Northampton Drive.
this guide essentially,
Is there?
yeah,
In half a
I think
mile, turn right onto Colony Drive.
Sorry about that, Ellis.
that's
Hold
all
on,
right.
I'll mute them right now.
Thank you.
So with the shopping guide, I was really trying to allow people to engage in an action that they could take every single day,
Take the next left onto Wurzbach Road.
and make a difference with their dollars. Really coming back to sort of the basis of ethical consumerism. It's all right. The 7th edition just came out in 2022, and that's the latest one, the one that Maurice held up. So a little bit of background on ethical consumerism. I remember back in the 70s and 80s, the emergence of something called corporate social responsibility. At first, it was obscure. In fact, some of the first efforts came out of a socially responsible investing movement. I believe that was spawned in part by an early group of sisters who were interested in having their funds divested from the military related investments and among other things. And that turned into later what was called the socially responsible investing movement, and now is called ESG. But corporate social responsibility was companies taking seriously this idea that they have a responsibility for the environmental, social, economic, and even political impacts on the communities that they are in contact with. So right around the 1980s, this came about, and then just in the last 10 years or so, it's morphed slightly. It's called corporate sustainability now, and almost every company that you can name has an annual report that they produce that you can take a look at for free that talks about their sustainability practices or responsibility practices. So that's the company side. On the consumer side, consumers were beginning to take this idea quite seriously, particularly coming out of the late 1960s as they began to look for other possibilities for social change. You started to see businesses emerge and then consumers emerge with a new focus on the environment and social justice. And people started thinking about, well, what if we pulled our dollars sort of collectively? Wouldn't they essentially add up to a significant impact in the world? So with this focus on sustainability and justice and fairness, people began to imagine themselves as ethical consumers, which at the time was just called voting with your dollars. Some called it green consumerism or conscious consumerism, but people began to vote with their dollars. So what ended up happening was a kind of communication system was put in place, a kind of very basic one, in which corporations and companies and businesses in general were saying, look, we care about these issues that you care about, and we're going to try to do something about it. And then consumers would look out for these businesses, and they would give them their money. They would say, oh, you're doing fair trade. Well, let me purchase things from you. Oh, you're doing organic. Let me purchase something from you. Oh, you're doing something to, help a particular cause for justice or for equity. Let me help you, right? And so this communication system began to be established back and forth. However, almost as soon as it was established, a problem came up. And that problem is known as, to this day, greenwashing. Originally, it was labeled greenwashing. It comes out of the term whitewashing, when somebody takes a sort of white coat of paint to coat over some, problematic thing on a side of a building. Greenwashing was specifically at first there to denote that companies were saying that they were doing wonderful things about the environment, but in fact, they weren't doing wonderful things for the environment. They were essentially just taking whatever they were doing, putting a little coat of green paint on it, and then reselling it to the public saying, oh, look, we're wonderful, please give us your money. And so these pro-environmental behaviors were not being taken seriously by the companies. And so we began to see this label arise called greenwashing. Greenwashing now encompasses not just pro-environmental, but pro-social behaviors. So what we have now is the greenwashing today is more sophisticated. It involves, issues of social justice and equity and local communities and all kinds of things. And there's so many forms of greenwashing, and sometimes they're specifically called things like local washing or equality washing, but typically we just refer to it as greenwashing. So the problem with greenwashing is that it begins to break down this communication system, because consumers cannot trust companies if they cannot tell what the greenwashing is and what the legitimate communication is. So suddenly the system is breaking down. It's a little bit like, and again, I'm sort of trained as an undergraduate, as a political scientist. It's a little bit like how people would like to vote for politicians, but if politicians lie about what they're going to do, then people don't know who to vote for because they can't trust what the politicians are saying. So the same problem exists in the world, the economic world, as the problem that we see sort of running roughshod in the political world. So let me just give you a taste for this problem to see how tricky it is. This is a test for your own greenwashing detector, and you're supposed to ask which companies are telling the truth. Now, in my own system, because I'm a teacher, I grade companies from A to F, just like I grade my students, mostly because I was graded A to F, and we all know what an A is and an F is and a C. We have a sense for that. So here's my first example. The question is this actual green behavior or is this greenwashing? These are a couple of ads that ran in an ad campaign that Chevron Mobile, I think, still has to this day, called the Human Energy Campaign. Chevron is obviously an oil company. You can gas up at their many gas stations. And in this series of ads, you have people saying things like, I will leave the car at home more, and I will use less energy. Now, these people seem very sincere, and they seem like very nice people. The other thing to note is that it's not just the ads themselves, but Chevron is an active sponsor of organizations that people do trust, like National Public Radio and like the Public Broadcasting System, PBS. So PBS and NPR both have this company as a sponsor. And so the question is, how should you, as a consumer, behave when you see the possibility of stopping at a Chevron station to gas up your car? You know, is it a good company? Is it a bad company? Is it somewhere in the middle? Well, according to all the publicly available data we have, which is what my system has been attempting to correlate over the past 25 years, Chevron gets an F. So this is a company that is very effective at greenwashing. They have wonderful ad campaigns, and you can actually read their full report every year about how much good they're doing in the world. But in fact, the data show otherwise. Here's another example. This is when people, for example, if you're at the mall and you need a new pair of jeans. I think about this often. If I need to buy my kids a pair of jeans to wear to school, and I have a choice between Levi's jeans and just a pair of jeans at Macy's. And so I look at the advertisements and I see that Levi's has a kind of, heartfelt, but not particularly detailed advertisement that talks about how everybody's work is equally important. Macy's has something much more specific, and it's about protecting the environment and the use of those styrofoam packing peanuts. They've changed it over to corn-based instead of foam-based or plastics-based packing. And so the question is, if I see a Macy's ad and a Levi's ad, which company can I trust? And of course, I don't know if consumers can really tell much from the ads, but the data over the past 25 to 35 years do demonstrate a very significant difference in the track records of these two companies. It turns out that Levi's actually earns an A and that Macy's earns an F, utilizing the same criteria and the same data over time. So the question becomes, how do consumers navigate this greenwashing problem? Well, a thoughtful consumer might, spend a lot of time researching or looking at labels or asking friends, etc. But really, we can't do everything, and we can't expect people to do all of this heavy lifting, particularly when they're up against a huge economic system that is profiting essentially from misleading consumers, because that's what they're doing to get a hold of those dollars that consumers are spending to try to make the world better. So what's really needed is a kind of sustainability rating system. And that is what I do. That is what I have been doing for the past 35 years. And at the moment, I'm still the only one in the US doing an effort like this. There are efforts in the UK, Australia. There are budding efforts in Japan. There are efforts in Europe. At the moment, there used to be a couple of different efforts in the US, but I'm the only one left. As a side note, particularly important for Earth Day, is that my focus and this research focus is really much more on the quality of our consumption rather than the quantity. And if you have been spending any time looking into the importance of the environment, you know that perhaps the biggest problem with our consumption is how much we consume. And we could solve a lot of problems on this planet by consuming less. Now, we actually have, the environmental movement is good about getting this message across, like reduce, reuse, recycle, repair, All of that is very important. We also have the voluntary simplicity movement and the simple living movement. These are all great movements that are helping people understand that the quantity of our consumption must be reduced. That to me is something that's being taken care of by these other movements. And I fully support that. However, we all do still need to consume something. We just can't get by on the planet without some level of consumption, even if it's very small. And with that amount of consumption, what I want us to focus on is the quality. What is the impact of those dollars? Are they going to increase justice in the world, or increase environmental sustainability, or increase equality, or are they going to essentially make these problems worse? And I think this is a legitimate question that people are asking. So when I think about this work, I always go back to my understanding of democracy. Again, I think it's in part my political science background. My bachelor's was in international relations at USC and then later international peace studies at Notre Dame. But I really got this sense that, democracy is something that we can cherish and that we value in our society. It's actually a very commonly held belief. What we've done essentially is set up a political system that allows us to at least express in part these democratic ideals. And what I am arguing is that what we really need to do is bring this cherished vision of democracy outside of the political system to expand into other systems. And in this case, the economic system. That if we really believe in sort of the voices of the people, that we need to begin to think about our economic system in different ways. So if democracy politically is really a way to disperse power from being collected at the top by sort of dictators or kings and queens and really disperse it among everyday people, we need to start thinking about the economy the same way. In this way, the best estimates that we have demonstrate that the average US family has around $25,000 of discretionary spending, and that is spending outside of things like taxes, medical expenses, rent or mortgage payments, and the things that you really don't have any choice over. This is stuff like food and gasoline and, clothing and toys and all of the other things we spend on. And it turns out that while it may not seem like a lot per family, it actually adds up to be quite a lot. In fact, the US economy is still to this day the largest economy on the planet. And it is estimated that almost 2/3 of our economy is driven exclusively by consumer buying patterns. So while, government spending and, interbusiness spending can create a lot of the economy, the vast majority is still run by consumers. So the way to think about this is that we don't have, unlike with our political system where we technically have 100% of the votes, at least for those people who vote, here we have about 2/3 of the votes. And yet that's 2/3 of the gasoline that fuels the largest engine on the planet. So this is incredibly important how we cast these votes, because this engine, the largest engine on the planet, really drives and shapes the planet as a whole. So as I began this work, I came personally out of the environmental movement, being inspired by, particularly in the 90s when I was an undergraduate, Earth Day 1990. So it's apropos that we're celebrating Earth Day today. That's where I was originally inspired. And what I loved about the environmental movement was their ability to access individuals. They didn't expect you to be an activist or come to their organizational meetings every week. What they expected you to do was take it seriously in your everyday life and then begin to practice a variety of actions that allowed you to engage. So I started with that. And then I quickly realized, as I began to research these various areas of ethical consumerism, that while the environment is a good start, we cannot stop with the environment. So we have to take seriously larger issues like human rights. And from a consumption standpoint, and this includes things like child labor issues and worker fatalities, sweatshops around the world. The environment is, of course, important, particularly with climate change and all our efforts for renewable energy, but also the protection of animals and animal ecosystems and habitats, and communities themselves. Being able to engage local communities, being able to make sure that communities are represented well by their political representatives, and then social justice as an issue that strives to help all of us be treated equally and have equal access. So it is sort of these 5 major areas that I've organized my research around. And at first I thought, well, who knows? I'm one person, maybe this is just filled with all of my biases, but I tried to be very sensitive to responding to all of the efforts that I saw actually emerging from the world of ethical consumerism itself. And these 5 areas seem to really map on very well to what people were asking for, including all the labels that you see, like animal testing labels or organic labels for the environment, or fair trade labels for human rights, or local and independent labels for communities. These were sort of mapping on each other. And it turns out later, and we can talk about this at some, maybe during the Q&A, it turns out that this basic set of issues is exactly what these efforts in other parts of the world are tracking. So this is not just a US movement, and it's definitely not just mine. It is something that is happening in Europe. It is something that is beginning in Asia, and it is something that is happening in Australia and New Zealand as well. So this is a global movement of consumers attempting to shift the economic engines of the world to begin to produce better results for all of us. In my own research, which has been going on for just, about 25 years now, I dig back about 35 years for my data. I have currently, I think it's just over 75 major sources of data. You can see some of them listed here. I couldn't put all of them because the screen would fill up too much, but you can see, Union of Concerned Scientists is there. You can see, Ethical Consumer or the Fair Trade Federation. B Corp is up there. Climate Counts, Council on Economic Priorities. There are just a number of organizations, mostly nonprofits. And one of the things that I do with my own research is I don't generate any data on my own. I really rely on the nonprofit community to generate that data, and then I vet those sources for their integrity, for their depth, for their sort of scientific approach, for their sort of data validity, et cetera, and then I weight them appropriately in the system. I will also note I don't take any data from companies themselves due to the danger of greenwashing. So I don't trust them. I know that they have a lot of self-interest involved, and so that they are likely to, bend the truth, just like any good politician might if they wanted your vote. They might bend the truth a bit if you ask them directly. But instead of looking at their words, what I do is I look at their actions. And their actions on the ground are the things that I track. So I take all of this data, and the database includes just over 2,500 companies now, and 75 or so consumer categories, and I rate them from A to F. And so you can see this is one of the early rating charts online for clothing. Some names you'll recognize, others you may not. And this allows consumers to sort of make better decisions with their dollars. This also allows me to generate things like the 20 worst list. This would be the worst 1% or so of all companies on the planet. Number 1 has always been ExxonMobil, by the way. Actually, the top 3 have never really changed. Every other part of the worst 20 has shifted over time, but not the top 3. ExxonMobil by far has held on to number 1 since the rating system began. And then Kraft, which used to be Altria, and now sort of includes a spinoff called Mondelez International, and finally Walmart at number 3. So most of these you'll probably recognize. The 20 best companies do shift quite a bit. In fact, even this chart has been shifting since I produced it. But you'll recognize a few of these: Some Generation, Organic Valley Method, Patagonia, maybe even Equal Exchange for coffee or chocolate, etc., Dr. Bronner's. But others, might seem a little more obscure. These tend to be smaller companies, just not quite on the scale, the multinational scale as the worst 20. I also create other lists, like lists of where to spend your effort when you're first starting off. So for example, if you want to really make a difference, the first thing you need to change is your bank. That would be my absolute, I know it's a pain to change where you bank, but that's where I would put my efforts first. After that, where you get your gasoline, what supermarket you shop at, retail stores, and then go down from there. So it gives people something to focus on because it can be very overwhelming. With these efforts, I've created not just this set of books, but also a website, a smartphone app. The shopping guides themselves have evolved. The rating system has evolved over time. I now, in this latest edition, actually, I've gotten rid of these very subtle grades of B- and B+ and all of that. And I just have A, B, C, D, F as the main system. And then at the top, I put a star. And this would be for the sort of best of the best, kind of the top 1%. And then an X at the bottom for sort of the worst, the bottom 1%. And that allows consumers to really focus on, okay, if I can avoid the X's, maybe I should start there, or maybe I could find some stars. And you'll notice that every now and then in these star categories, there are things that aren't actual companies like farmers markets or food co-ops. These are actually structures within our economic system that are incredibly important to support and do so much good in so many ways that they sort of get head and shoulders above the actual business brands. I also provide just some details, a breakdown on what it means when you support one of the best choices or one of the worst choices, and then a few online resources that you can go and research yourself. So I think I've finished my 25 minutes. I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to questions, but I will also tell you that I think I offered this originally, Maurice, when we had spoken earlier, but I wanted to offer it to everybody on the presentation Zoom today, and that is, if you would like to order any books, I am happy to get you books off through the website or through email. They are $15 each. If you order more than 5, like between 5 and 9 books, I can get them to you for half price. And if you order more than 10, I essentially can get them for you at what they cost me. So $5 each. And I do this in particular in case there are people who would like to use the book as fundraisers, because at the $5 price point, you can probably sell it for 10 and then actually make some money if you need to fundraise for any particular organization or maybe event. And this might be a useful resource that people are interested in. Anyway, that is it. And I'll hand it over to Maurice for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. We really appreciate your presentation. I'm sure that's stoked our own questions and desire to shop more sustainably and just to do the right thing. I was just struck by your book. I've been following the Better World Shopping Guide since its 2nd edition, I believe, back when I used to work for the Franciscan Sisters. I'd wholeheartedly encourage everybody to, yeah, just order a bunch so you can pass them along to your friends. And thank you, Ellis, for that generous discount you're offering.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I do see at least one question that's come in. Dr. Jones, if you would, please. Says, during the pandemic, we were encouraged to spend in order to save the economy. Sounds like the same thing like after 9/11. That's my own addition there.
Yeah.
The person says, it seems that our economy was built on a house of cards. They ask, could you talk about how a cyclical economy might be instituted?
Oh boy, great question. I'll try to keep my answers brief but specific. So I also remember 9/11, and it struck me that the president at the time had also asked, George W. Bush had asked us to spend. And I want you to take those moments to realize it's moments where we sort of wake up and realize if these very powerful politicians are telling us that they need us to spend, it is actually one of the moments in which we can realize how much power we have. Because what happens in any crisis, and happened in 9/11, I actually use this as a topic for my own class. The savings rate in the US is abysmal. Generally speaking, it's about 2 to 3% on average. But whenever there's a huge crisis like 9/11 that scares people, or COVID, people save, and they save a lot. It's actually a really good practice because they save as much as they actually should save, which is right around 10% or so. But it's the only time we do it. And it's because we get a bit scared and, conservative with our money. And that's when the politicians start showing up and they say, spend your money. And it's because we're withholding the gasoline from this engine. And the engine is otherwise just going like gangbusters. And so in those moments, you can see that this is essential. Like, our spending is incredibly powerful. It is the main source of fuel. So in the long run, we really do need to set an economy that has a slower pace, that is more sustainable, both for individual consumers, that helps us save and sort of, build equity, and is more sustainable for the environment as we consume less, and then that we can consume in ways that create sort of circularity. So the circularity idea actually comes from the environmental movement, where they begin to talk about that sort of reduce, reuse, recycle, and repair. That is about trying to take these items that are usually going through the system, like creation and then use and then waste, and then they end up in a landfill, that sort of singular system, the linear system, and turn it into a more circular system in which you create something, you use it, and then you repair it, and you repair it, and you fix it, and you reuse it, and you do all of this stuff. And when it finally is at the end of its days, you make sure that you are able to, it's made out of materials to begin with that you can pull apart and recycle, and then it's created into something else new. So there's not new resources needing to come in at the front. And thus you create this sort of sustainability circle. And that's actually based on how nature operates, right? Nature doesn't waste things. It just kind of creates and regenerates and recreates, and the waste turns into fuel. And that's, for a long-term sustainable economy, you need it to mirror those ecological systems. And, I can talk forever about how our economy is out of balance, in part because of how off it is from mapping our economic models on ecological systems, which are much more sort of biodiverse and much more adaptable and flexible and rugged, and they can deal with challenges much better, but not our economies. So when we get these moments of 9/11 or COVID, right, suddenly there's a fragility involved because the economies themselves are not set up sustainably. And so it's those moments that we really should, take a breath and realize that we really do have quite a bit of power.
Thank you. Another question came in from North Dakota. Many deeply red states have or are banning all investments in any companies or investment groups that have an ESG policy. You familiar with ESG?
Yep.
Environment, social, and governance policy. This is creating investment havoc and redirecting funding to fossil fuels and related products such as plastics. That was the comment coming from, I think she's referring to her own state and other red states of North Dakota. Do you have any comments about how they're banning investment?
I do. So a couple of comments. The first thing I want to say again, and not to be Pollyanna about it, but when I saw ESG suddenly show up on the map of these sort of conservative movements in various states, it actually gave me hope. Whenever it shows up on the radar like that, it's only because it's finally it's finally gained enough power to make a difference. That's why there's pushback. If there was no pushback, it would just be insignificant. But now the socially responsible investing movement, as we called it way back, SRI, but now ESG, the environmental social governance movement, has a global momentum behind it that is actually quite daunting for many companies and many politicians, and thus the pushback. And I think these efforts will ultimately fail, or they'll move on to something else. But I think, again, it's worth noting that this is happening because it means that this power is being felt. And it's being measured, both the power of the ethical consumer, which is enormous amounts of dollars. This is also why, if you ever get depressed that these little companies and green companies are getting gobbled up by the big corporations, it is because they are so profitable. It's because there are so many people that want to do the right thing, that the amounts of money that are going into this part of our consumption system are just enormous, and companies will do anything to get at that money. And so the other thing I wanted to mention is that while, as a sociologist, I'm always a little bit of a contradiction. I'm really focused on individuals and practical and effective and efficient, right? And I think the access point in our culture in particular in the 21st century is to access individuals as the sort of gateway. But to be honest, our power is not as individuals. Our power is as a collective. Our power is us, not me, not you, but us. And it is there that where our real muscle shows, just like in democracies. Democracies can be healthy or they fail based on how we behave. And so this book can be used by individuals, but it's actually much more powerful if it's used by businesses, by nonprofit organizations, and by people who work with investments. Because then you're dealing not with one person's dollar, but with a big group of people's dollars. And once you start shifting those things around based on which companies are doing good or not so good, and which ones are ethical and which ones aren't, then that is really felt by the system. It is multiplied so much more. So while the starting point is the individual, right, the real sort of ultimate goal is to begin to look at our organizations and their investments, their business-to-business practice. And I've heard from many of these businesses directly that they appreciate the book because it allows them to know what other businesses they want to work with, so that they can begin supporting another business that's doing the right thing, and vice versa. So they'll get their coffee from Equal Exchange and they'll buy their paper from, New Leaf Paper, right, for their copy machines, and vice versa. And thus creating a sort of almost like little micro climate ecosystem for our economy, like these little patches of economic experiments that can thrive.
Thank you. Throw a couple of questions at you. What do you think of using credit unions versus banks? Or what about promoting tiny house living?
Oh, well, I mean, both of those things are great. So anytime I go anywhere, if I move, I've been here 15 years, but the first thing I did was find a credit union, find a local credit union, right? They are governed differently than banks are. Most of them are smaller. The dollars are circulated much more locally. They're not set up to be sort of both the profit-driven enterprises and to invest in the vulnerable investments of large banks, which we found out with that financial crisis not long ago. So I'm a huge fan of local credit unions. So I would recommend that to anyone, and I do in the book. And then as far as what was the second thing, Maurice?
Oh, thank you. About tiny house living?
Oh yeah, the tiny houses. So, I came out of for many years I taught at UC Davis in Davis, California, and there was a lot of experimenting with cooperative housing and collective housing in Davis, and tiny housing is I think an important step as well. My mother is Swedish, and she was born in Sweden and grew up on a Swedish farm. And the Swedish people in particular are good at building very tiny houses. And a few of you know this, but most of you probably do not. I was recently awarded a Fulbright, and I'll be taking my family to Japan for the next year. And I will be teaching at 2 different universities in Japan. And the Japanese are also very well known for their ability to create very efficient, very small, low footprint housing units in a way that is livable and that can keep enormous amounts of people sort of socially aware of each other, and it's some kind of harmony given very small spaces. So I'm a big believer in that for us in this country.
Awesome. Couple of comments. Just so you know, one of our associates for the Presentation Sisters is, I believe, a state senator in North Dakota. Hence that question a while ago about red states. She says, maybe I will buy 50 of your books and give them all to the North Dakota Senate.
Well, well, if you want 50 to give to the Senate, just email me directly and I'll just send them to you. You don't even have to buy them. I would love to be a part of something like that. So just drop me the address wherever I need to send them and I will drop them in the mail. That sounds lovely to me.
Just so you know, that person's name is Kathy. Don't everybody write Ellis and ask for 50 free books now. This person's name is Kathy Ellis. So just so you know, no, our people wouldn't do that. Another comment came in. Thank you for your book. It just arrived. I got it after your session with Sister Annie the other day.
Oh, yeah.
Comment on counter recycle, please.
On what recycle?
This person who's also named a different Kathy asked, comment on counter recycle. I'm not sure what she means by that. Is there a term called counter recycling or recycling your counters? Okay.
No.
Kathy, write us back and let us know. She says in the house. Not sure, Kathy. Sorry about that. You can unmute yourself if you'd like, Kathy, just explain.
Using small receptacles and which ones to use and how often to recycle, and using using bags that are compostable, things like that.
Got it. Got it. So yeah, not many municipalities have this or support it, but there are some that are starting to show up. And I know, for example, this is a huge deal in Japan. In fact, you have to go down to a local municipality, you buy a whole set of bags that are all different colors and have little symbols on them and that are coded. And then you have to take your bags and you have to put the materials that are for recycling in the different bags, and you have to tie them with a very particular string and all of this stuff. And what it does is it allows the recycling and the composting and the reusing and the landfill and all of these other ways in which they dispose of waste to be hyper efficient, right? So the way that we recycle in this country tends to not ask a lot of us, but it also tends to create a system that is not particularly efficient and doesn't get great results. It relies a lot on markets, and it relies a lot on consumers getting it right, even though most consumers don't have the right information. And so if you have a municipality that supports those things, then I would encourage you to begin practicing that, because at some point in the future, we will be doing the same thing. We'll just have to become more educated about exactly what goes where. And having said that, let me just create a little bit of a counterpoint to this comment. And that is, one of the things I think is important to note with this ethical consumerism movement is that at the same time, while we take our responsibility seriously, very much like with recycling, with our dollars, we're now taking that seriously. We also need to push for the businesses to take their side of the equation seriously. So we need to push them. We need to let them know through letters, through emails, through messages, through political action, whatever, that they have to take their side seriously, because if they create things that are more easy to recycle and, reuse and rebuild and repair, et cetera, then it's easier for us as well. And then when they are more honest about their communications, and when they have more third-party certifications that are easy for us to navigate, then we can become ethical consumers more easily as well. So we want to make sure that we don't take this on ourselves. It is something we have control over, but we shouldn't bear this burden alone. We are just a part of what needs to happen. So businesses need to shift, government, we need to shift. We need to think of ourselves, but also our communities together. And so, recycling can often lead people to take on too much burden by themselves. And what we need to be is both taking it on responsibly and then thinking outward.
Great. Ellis, how do we get local governments to adopt effective sustainability plans? Is there any place doing it well?
So this is great. And I love how the question is focused on local government, because that's exactly where we need to start, right? You know, we can look for legislation at the national level and we can push for it when it's around, and the same at the state level, et cetera. But the real differences can be made at the local level, right? By organizing neighbors and communities and people that we know. Our voice is so much louder in those settings. And so the great thing is that there are efforts like this all over the place. I don't have towns to list for you, unfortunately, at the tip of my tongue, but there are towns and municipalities all over the US, and there are definitely towns and municipalities all over the world that have taken many of these things on successfully and, you know, create roadmaps for us. So one thing we don't have to do is reinvent the wheel. What you do is you look for those points of inspiration and you essentially copy and paste and then adjust and adapt what they're doing and see what works. You know, you might have to try a few different times. I remember this from the Peace Corps when I was in Panama. You know, I spent a long time listening for months to my community, and then we tried things. And some of them took things that I thought were not going to take off, did take off, and vice versa. So come in with a sort of spirit of creativity and flexibility and persistence, and we'll get things done.
Awesome. So Ellis, I heard you say that the bottom 10, especially the bottom 3 of the corporations, beginning with number 1, ExxonMobil, number 2, Kraft, and number 3, Walmart, really hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
This relates to a question that just came in. What are the weaknesses that make some companies rank with an F? I would expand that to say, what's going on with any one of those 3 companies or all 3 of them that consistently rank them at the bottom of the bottom? ExxonMobil, Kraft, and Walmart. Any comment about that?
Sure. Well, let me just take ExxonMobil since it's number 1. I mean, and has been since the beginning. You should know a few things. One is that ExxonMobil for decades was the most profitable company on the planet. And it was that for good reason. They would do anything to increase the profit margin. There's literally nothing off the table for ExxonMobil. It is not even a question. So whatever would increase profit is something they would do. And sometimes it was easy to see through, and sometimes it was difficult to see through. So I remember at some point realizing that they gave something like $60 million to the Save the Tiger Fund. And I thought, wow, that's so great. They're saving tigers. And you know what that is? That turns into real tigers, by the way. $60 million for a little nonprofit is a huge thing. But $60 million for ExxonMobil is something that they would make, you know, in a few hours. And so what they get is the PR campaign around that costs much more than the 60 million. And their sort of benefit by getting this sort of philanthropic halo is enormous, right? For the public to see that and read about that in ad campaigns and on their website, et cetera. I was telling this story to a ProPublica reporter actually a few hours ago, who has been investigating the plastics industry. They have a new way that they're trying to pretend to recycle plastics. That's actually another greenwashing. And ExxonMobil's at the head of it. So one thing that I mentioned to her was that Human Rights Campaign, which they just look at LGBTQ issues and how they deal with policies for their employees and if they treat them fairly and equitably and if they have it as a real policy or not. And they score from 0 to 100. Every company, you know, what their policies are. And it's easy to get 100. It's not a particularly difficult thing, but some companies get it for many years running, and some companies, you know, get lower scores, and some get a 0. But for ExxonMobil, they created a whole other category, and they created -25. There's no other company that they broke their own system to say how bad they were at this one policy. And they just essentially said, like, okay, everybody gets a 0 to 100, but not ExxonMobil. They get a -25. And it was because they were doing things that were just off the charts, that just no other company was doing. that they were doing. The other thing is, if you track climate change at all, you know about the junk science that was created, and particularly in the late 80s and early 90s. There was something called the Global Climate Coalition, which was petroleum companies that essentially all came together to sort of suppress and block climate change research with junk science, saying like, well, we don't know, it's sort of like cancer. We don't know if smoking actually causes cancer. Look at this science, that kind of stuff. Same thing. But it turns out that they were the ones who were behind the effort in the first place. So they got all the other companies involved. As each company left that effort, as they saw the environmental movement taking off and climate change was real, they all left one by one, but ExxonMobil was the last one standing. And it turns out when they dug into the records of ExxonMobil, it was the first corporation to know that climate change existed and have data on it in the 70s, before even public scientists had data on it. And then they of course, kept that out of the public knowledge so that they could keep doing what they were doing. Again, you can imagine how far we'd be with climate change if we were starting this stuff in the 70s when we discovered the research. So this is just a little bit of what ExxonMobil has been doing and continues to do, by the way. And I monitor these companies, from year to year. And ExxonMobil has not turned over any kind of a new leaf. It is definitely earning every day its #1 position.
Insidious. Wow. Just in the last 60 to 90 seconds, take one more question, Ellis. Sister writes in, what about the danger of, maybe she means dangers of capitalism? Any just synopsis that you might offer us from your perspective about the danger of capitalism?
I'll tell you what I tell my students when I teach them about capitalism in my course. First of all, I tell them that capitalism has not always been our global economic system. Most of human history, we didn't have capitalism. So we live in a time of capitalism now. It's mostly a global capitalism. And to be honest, most of us will likely die in capitalism. So I say it's not going anywhere anytime soon, but I will let you know that in 1,000 years, I would bet you money that the capitalism won't be around in 1,000 years. It wasn't really around 1,000 years ago. And so I don't think it's going to be around 1,000 years from now either. It would be a lot of hubris, right? It's always, we imagine things to be, we're so important, full of our self-importance that we imagine things will always be the way they are because we feel like we're so advanced. So I don't think it'll be around 1,000 years from now. Maybe 100 years from now, it won't be around, but I imagine most of my students will probably live and die in capitalism. Having said that, I don't think it's a black and white question. For me, like most systems, if you look at capitalism in different time periods, and across different countries and cultures in the world, capitalism looks very different. Capitalism looks different in Russia than it does in China, than it does in Sweden, than it does in the US. And so what I say is like, don't worry about overthrowing capitalism just yet. Something at some point we'll get some other ideas involved. But I tell my students to think about it on a spectrum from humane to brutal, and to start mapping where the countries are in the world on that. How brutal is their capitalism and how humane is it? Because I would argue that, for example, China is actually better at capitalism than almost any country in the world, but it is a more brutal form of capitalism than we have here. And their GDP is growing. And by the way, in the next 10 years, theirs will be the #1 economy. So oddly, the most communist country in the world will be the most capitalist successful country in the world. But it's because they've adopted a brutal form. And ours is not quite that brutal. But there are other countries that have examples of capitalism that are even more humane and treat the environment even better and treat human beings even better. And I think what we should do is we should work to get our capitalism to move in those directions. And then, at some point we'll be ready for a change. I don't think it's tomorrow, but I think it's still possible to work within this system. I think there's always hope. And whenever you are, no matter where you are, there are choices to be made, and there are better and worse choices. That's part of the reason I call these books the Better World Shopping Guide, not the Perfect World Shopping Guide, right? I think there are always choices. None of them are perfect. Just like voting in the next election, you won't have perfect choices, but you will have better choices and worse choices. And that's all I think we can ask for. And so I think we always have to support those choices that move us in that better direction.
Well, thank you, Ellis, on this Earth Day for nudging us towards that better direction, towards a more humane capitalism. And one takeaway I heard from you say that there's certainly power in individuals but there's power in collectives and groups. And as presentation people, we call ourselves both sisters and associates, friends of Nano, employees, etc. We have power, and your book and your presentation can serve us quite well. I know it has served me well over the years. So thank you so much for gracing us on this Earth Day evening with your presence, with your research, with your convictions, with your teaching style. It's very, very effective. We very much appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for all the good work that I know you guys are doing every day. It's really appreciated.
Right. So on this Earth Day, as it brings back good memories for Ellis, it brings back memories perhaps for each of us. Sometimes we still hear of folks who were around for the first Earth Day back in 1970. Certainly this Earth Day of 2024 is memorable for me as it is for all of you. So if we ponder the blessings of Earth Days in the past, we ponder the blessing of our Earth Day this evening, and on those we love this day, and on every human family, the blessings of heaven, the blessings of earth, and the blessings of sea and sky be with you.